Carolina have a straight line across there, a clear dividing line. Back in those days, that's not how it was conceived. So it's a little bit, it's a crooked line and it's hard to tell. So the first story that I want to talk about is what was going on in Tidewater, Virginia, and how it might be related to our family. So there were three Richard Taylors in a row that we think are the beginning of a family in the United States, in the American colonies. Not the United States. This is long before anybody had any idea about the United States. So we don't know for sure where he came from. We don't know when. We have some firm documentary evidence from a letter that was sent from London to Virginia that he had a sister who lived in London and was married to a butcher, and they had a butcher shop in the middle of the city, not too far from St. Paul's Cathedral. Or if you're a criminal law aficionado, from the Old Bailey, the London Criminal Court. But we don't know where those kids were born, or who their parents were, or even when they were born. So that's who the family's been referring to as Richard I. So there's a connection somehow between him and a man named Roger Hodges. The Hodges family believes that there's a particular record of this Roger Hodges in London. It appears that somebody with that name, and they think it's the Roger Hodges that ends up being associated with our family, was a juvenile delinquent in London, in that same part of London where Richard's sister ended up living, that was picked up for vagrancy, and the law at the time was that if you didn't have a means of support, some of the facilities that were taking care of juvenile delinquents could forcibly make you go to Bermuda and work for 10 years on a plantation and then get your freedom to do whatever you wanted in the New World. And so this Roger Hodges was put on a ship at Gravesend, which was one of the ports in the London area, and shipped out in 1635 to Bermuda. Now when you look at the records in Bermuda, there's some reference to some Hodges and Taylors that were there in this very early period, but not enough to know for sure what happened to Roger Hodges. But the Hodges family thinks that Roger, that was put on the ship to go to Bermuda in 1635, is the same one that ended up owning land next to Richard Taylor in a county that at the time was called Lower Norfolk County. So, this Richard Taylor that we claim is probably an ancestor, acquired some land in the mid-1600s on a branch of the Elizabeth River called Julian's Creek. And it's a real place. I work with a gentleman in a family search center here who grew up in a town that's near there now. He's a little bit older than me, but not much, so you can tell about when he would have been growing up. And I told him where we think our family came from, and he tells me that, oh, that's where I used to go play. So it is a real place. Real people live there. And it's still known as Julian's Creek. And you can look at it. Actually, I've got some maps. You can see the course of the Elizabeth River coming down. Portsmouth is what the name of the town is now. And the yellow stuff is where the Taylor land is located. If you're interested in seeing these maps and having access to them so that you can play with them, They are in the memories section of these early Taylors. So if you go into the family search pages for Joseph Jr., Joseph Sr., one of our cousins who works in the mapping business has made good copies, and I think the ones that I put up here are ones that he put on to the memories. Let's see if I can figure out how to back up. There were 3 dots on that first map. There was a red dot at the top, a red dot in the middle, and a red dot at the bottom. Does anybody know how to back these things up?
Do you have arrow keys on there? On the screen, I mean on the keypad? Arrows?
If you could put back arrow.
So there's a place called Old Rappahannock in Virginia that's about 60, 80 miles north of Norfolk. That's at the top of the map. In the middle of the map is the county that's lower Norfolk, and that's where Julian's Creek is. And then on the bottom of the map is where the Conedo Creek is in North Carolina, where the family moved after 3 or 4 generations. If you go on Family Search, or if you go on a lot of the commercial programs, you will find that the person we think of as Richard of Julian's Creek is frequently merged with a second Richard Taylor, who was in Old Rappahannock. So you've got 2 Richard Taylors that we know about that are treated as the same person in a lot of the family trees. So if you get interested in this and you want to work on understanding the early part of our family history, you have to be really careful here and not get these 2 mixed up. Richard of Julian's Creek, we don't know when he was born. He had a sister in London. He owned land on Julian's Creek. He married Margaret Manning. They had children. We know the names of their children from his will. And Margaret and Richard died in about 1679, and their wills were probated at the same time in lower Norfolk County. The Richard Taylor in Old Rappahannock County is suspected of being a descendant of James Taylor, who was the ancestor of Zachary Taylor. And over the years, we've proven with DNA that we're not part of that James Taylor family. So first off, we know because of DNA that the Richard Taylor from Old Rappahannock County is probably not related, because the DNA is a problem. But we know where he owned land. He owned land in North Farnham Parish, Richmond County. He was married to Sarah. They had children, 3 of them. And he died at the same time as the other Richard, but his will was probated in a completely different county, a 2 or 3 day ride away by horse. So one of the problems in doing the research back in this period is that a lot of people want to conflate these 2 people and have these 2 different people be the same person. So you have to be very careful when you're dealing with it, that you don't get pulled in and falls in the wrong direction.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Okay, one of these, on that other family, they raised kids from neighbors whose parents died. And I don't even know if we have the names of those kids, but I'm just wondering if that's how some of this DNA stuff gets mixed up.
So that's one of the issues that's interesting if you want to get into it. Well, the question is, what about children that were raised by other families? One of the things that's interesting in these wills, from the period of time that we're talking about with Richard, is that quite often we're running into large sums of money, relatively speaking, being willed to a godson or a goddaughter that's the child of one of the neighbors. And so, and the other thing that shows up is when they die before their children are all in majority is, who are the children being sent to live with? And so, behind the question that's being asked is the fact that once we started doing Y-DNA testing, we found that our DNA is identical to a group of Hodges, right? And the thing that makes it a complex story and makes you wonder what happened is that Roger Hodges owned land next to Richard Taylor. And when Richard died before his children were of the age of majority, one of the children was sent to live with Roger Hodges. And Roger Hodges was the executor of the estate for our Richard Taylor family. So there's a bunch of interaction at that level with the Hodge family. Another one of the Taylors at this very time gave a fortune to a Hodge girl that lived in the area that we're talking about. I haven't been able to figure out what that's about, but there's an Archibald Taylor that was one of the wealthy Taylors, and he gave half of his estate, which would be hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not into the millions today, to a Hodges girl from down in the same area that we're talking about. So there are some, once you start looking at the details of these real estate transactions, there aren't any church records to make clear when people got married and when they were confirmed or baptized at church. So about all you have is wills and deeds to sort out the relationships, and it's a little bit difficult. But somehow with these connections between the Hodges family in early Virginia and the Richard Taylor family, we believe that's someplace in there is where this connection comes from. Yeah.
So the next step would be to go, if we can find cousins, to go back to England or whatever, right? If you go back another generation, you have a whole bunch more people, right, that would be involved with that.
And it's a problem, they can't hear what you're saying back here. Not a word.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you follow, if there would be people somewhere in England or in the British Isles who would have the same Y DNA. It may not be Taylor's, but they'd have the same Y DNA.
Go ahead. Actually, most of us have finished eating. But there's a whole bunch of food in the kitchen. Have a seat.
There may be Taylors, there may be Hodges, or something else. I'm just saying, it'd be nice if we could eventually get to that step.
Right, so tomorrow I'm going to talk a little bit about our DNA projects, and that's one of the things that we're hoping to do is we've got 3 or 4 questions that we think we might be able to get some answers to, having to do with DNA. We've got a branch of our family that's over in South Carolina that we know is closely connected with DNA. And we know we're closely connected with this group of Hodges. It's not the whole Hodges family, but one little group. And so I'll talk about that project tomorrow. But that project and the issues are all set up by this situation that was going on in Julian's Creek in the mid-1600s with the Hodges and the Mannings and the Taylors living next to each other, and the Owens. One of the boys went to live with the Owens that were next door neighbors and ended up marrying one of the daughters. So one branch of our family is based on that connection. Well, so this is another one of the maps from that set about lower. This shows a little bit more detail about the land holdings. So, what do we know about the period after these 3 Richards in Julian's Creek? In 1760, Joseph Taylor Sr. finalized the acquisition of some land at a place called Conedo Creek, North Carolina. And then he stayed there until 1809 when I went to Warren County, Kentucky with part of his family, including William Taylor. So you can see what the map of the U.S. looked like in 1820. Missouri was on the western edge, and we were moving around from Julian's Creek to Conejo Creek, North Carolina, to Warren County, Kentucky, which is Bowling Green. And then we moved up to Monroe County in eastern Missouri, and then into western Missouri. So that's kind of an outline of where we're headed. This is the document where we acquired the land in Conejo Creek. And you can see the survey. This is both the certification and it's the surveyor's map of the area of the farm. And this is kind of what it looks like now. You can tell that there's some high ground and some very low ground. The green's the very low ground. But there's two creeks. The Conejo Creek is together in one piece at the bottom bottom left-hand corner. But you can see the split there. And in current day, the fork on the right is known as Crisp Creek. Well, one of their neighbors, when they bought land there, was Crisp. And the legal description of the farm that they acquired has the name Crisp in it. So you know that those lands are valid, and this kind of shows the general area. The water along the creeks the land is very low. It's a swampy area. And you can see where the drawing of the land on the map comes right up against the county line. Another thing to remember when you're looking at things back this far in our history, states started out with a few big counties, and as they went along, they ended up with a lot of small counties. So in regard to this property, when the property was acquired by Joseph Taylor, it was in Tyrell County. The property didn't move, but the county lines moved. So after a while, it became part of Martin County. And then a little bit later, it became part of Edgecombe County. So it's in what's called Edgecombe County now. And the land is actually on the county line. So the line between Edgecombe County and Martin County goes right along the land. This breaks out the different pieces that were owned by Joseph and his brothers. Joseph sold part of the land to two people that appear to be his brothers, a Richard Taylor, who would be Richard IV, maybe, and Thomas. In about 1810, Joseph Jr. and some of the family, as I mentioned before, moved to Kentucky. William Taylor would have been a young man, and there was a kind of the western expansion where people were leaving. You know, the new generation grows up, they want land of their own, and there's no new land where they're living, so they go west to where there's new land. And so a group of the Taylors headed west. Some of them went to a county which became Tennessee. Two of the daughters married Wallace brothers, and they stayed in this county in Tennessee, Stewart County. And the other group cut up to the north, just a little bit before Stewart County. These aren't very far apart. And went to Warren County, Kentucky, and bought land there. This map was made in 1877, and it shows the area around Richardville, which is the area where our family settled. And it shows the different places, the different people who owned land that point. And you'll notice, looking at that, a lot of them are Taylors, and a lot of them are families that married into the Taylors. I couldn't find one that was any video that showed this. One of our relatives did a hand-drawn map of the area showing where the original family members owned land. This shows where the cemetery is. Have any of you been out to Richardsville and seen the Taylor Cemetery there? There's a cemetery that's built on the land that Joseph Taylor and his family acquired in around 1810. And it's full of graves of our ancestors and some of the slaves that worked for them. Around this land, she has marked where Jake, who was one of the slaves that was freed, where he lived. And it shows here where the land of William Taylor was, and Alan Taylor, where Joseph Taylor's original land was. So if you've been there, you've seen these places. And it's actually quite easy to find if you go. I'm going to try to go again this summer. I might not succeed, but I'm going to try to go. Yeah.
I'm just going to tell you that the land there is still owned by descendants of the family.
Exactly. Yeah. Some of our cousins that we actually know still own this land. And we actually, as an organization, try to make sure that the cemetery is taken care of. Sometimes we're more successful than other times, but we do make an attempt to do our part to keep it fixed up and clean. When I started going there in the early 90s, the family that owned their cousins that owned the property and were taking care of, were not taking care of the cemetery very well. They weren't trimming the grass, the cows were grazing over into the cemetery ground, and it was a mess. But since then, they've had some cleanup projects, and it's taken care of a little bit better. But still, it's a project that we try to help fund and organize to keep this taken care of. Well, just like what happened almost every other generation, William Taylor and two of his brothers-in-law decided that they ought to go up to the new place where there's new land, and that was in Monroe County, Missouri. And the next map will show you kind of a timeline of where our family owned land in Missouri. The first place that they acquired land in Missouri for the period 1830 and 1835 was Monroe County on the east side. It's kind of Mark Twain territory. You read stories about Mark Twain. In fact, Mark Twain's parents owned land just on the other side of the river from what our Taylors and Allreds owned land at this particular place. The river there is the Salt River, and the Allreds and the Taylors tended to be just south and east of the Salt River, and the Clemens family was buying land on the north side of the river. I think it's not possible that our relatives met Samuel Clemens because he was born the same time they were moving to western Missouri. So they missed each other, but their families were acquiring land and going to this part of Missouri at the same time. So they sold their land in 1935 and they started moving west. There's two things that happened that I thought were interesting. There was a riot in Independence in 1833. Church members who were in Independence were threatened. They had a printing press there that was destroyed. They were in the process of printing a book called the Book of Commandments. And that that was destroyed. It turns out that John Taylor claims that he was in Independence when that happened. When they got to Utah, he went into the church historian's office and dictated a deposition to them explaining what happened to him. He was there when the mob came to destroy the press, and he indicates that he retrieved some of the copies of the printing that was going on for the Book of Commandments. There is a story published in the church history book, the new one, about two teenage girls who did the same thing. But he says that he helped pull out some of the pages for that printing and was involved in that activity. So some people in the family have assumed that because he was there on this day in 1833, that the family had moved into Independence from Monroe County, but they have not. The family was still living in Monroe County, and nobody knows for sure why John was there. Well, he was a young man. Maybe he had left home, like 20-year-olds tended to do in those days, and went to find his own way.
Is that William's oldest son?
Yeah, that's what
William's oldest son.
William's oldest son, John. Yeah. So we don't know for sure. Maybe he was just over there on a lark. Maybe he'd just gone to see what was going on and was going to go be on his way back. But the family still owned their land in Monroe County. We're still living there. In fact, one of the books I brought is called The Far West Record, which is the official history of the church in this particular time. And it indicates that one of the people who knew the Taylors and the Allreds had gone into the High Council in Independence and told them that he was concerned about the Taylors and the Allreds out in Monroe County and thought it was dangerous for them and wondered if they'd be better off coming into Independence or into Jackson County or to Ray County. Nothing was done about it, but there's a report of that happening. So some of you will know that there was a thing called Zion's Camp in 1834. So there's a letter that it's easy to find now that the Joseph Smith Papers Project has put so much online. But Joseph Smith was bringing people from Kirtland, Ohio, to help defend the members of the church in Jackson County. They call it the Camp of Israel or Zion's Camp. His brother Hiram had swung up through Canada to get some, and just before as they got to the Mississippi River, Joseph didn't have a way across. They were waiting for a ferry, and he dictated a letter to his wife and explained what was going on and told her that they were going to cross the river and stay at Allred Settlement on the Salt River and bring all of the forces together that were involved with Zion's Camp. And that's what happened. Within a short period, they were able to get the people from Kirtland across the Mississippi River. They marched over to Salt River, to the Allred Settlement, or the Salt River Settlement.